You survived Venar 7? Captain Varric Solane leaned in, his eyes sharp, the disbelief crackling in his voice like static on an overloaded comlink. The bar fell silent, every pair of eyes locking on Sergeant Drakain Taranis, the dead man walking. I did, Drakain answered, his voice low like the grinding of metal on stone. Barely. His cybernetic arm clicked as he rested it on the edge of the bar, the joints hissing faintly with hydraulic tension. His silhouette seemed larger under the dim, flickering lights, his weathered face marked by shadows and stories. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with curiosity and fear, like the calm before a plasma storm. Tell us, said Private Loran Virus, barely able to contain himself, his youth betraying him. His four-fingered hand tightened around his drink, talons tapping against the glass. What really happened out there? Drakain took a slow breath, tasting the recycled air, stale with sweat and burnt protein rations. His synthetic eye adjusted, flickering softly as it scanned the curious faces around him, lingering just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Venar 7 didn't fall in a battle, Drakain began, his gaze distant as if looking through the walls and into the abyss of memory. It drowned in a war we never understood. We thought we were fighting creatures, something we could predict. But the Hive Legion, they don't fight. They consume. The words hung in the air like smoke, dark and suffocating. The clink of glasses and whispered side conversations had vanished entirely, leaving only the hum of the bar's laser plasma displays, glowing softly with tactical feeds and casualty reports in the background. Outside the reinforced windows, the stars burned cold and indifferent. Captain Solane frowned, folding his arms. And you're saying a human saved you? Drakain's lip twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. Saved might be the wrong word. He changed everything. The sky above Outpost Delta was a violent swirl of black and green. Enemy drones swarmed like locusts, their metallic wings slicing through the thick air with a screech that set teeth on edge. Plasma bolts burned through the gloom, leaving streaks of sizzling blue light that vanished as fast as they appeared. Hold the line. Drakain's voice cut through the chaos, raw and fierce. He raised his plasma edge rifle, firing in tight bursts. The weapon spat glowing slugs into the enemy tide, but for every drone that fell, 2 more took its place. The Hive adapted too quickly. Drakain's HUD, projected directly onto his retinas, flashed red warnings. Shield integrity critical. His neurolinked combat suit groaned in protest, its energy reserves rapidly draining. He felt every pulse of the suit's failing systems like needles in his spine. Commander on comms. Where's my extraction? Static. Silence. The comm network was gone, fried in the electromagnetic surge caused by the Hive's ion storm weaponry. Drakain cursed under his breath, switching to manual overrides as his squad fell back into the crumbling perimeter. The ground beneath them shook violently as one of the outpost turrets detonated, showering them in molten shrapnel. The tang of scorched metal filled Drakain's lungs, his breathing ragged inside the helmet. His squad's retreat became a frantic scramble for cover. Taranis, we're cut off! Lieutenant Kadros Veller's voice barked through what remained of the local channel. The Hive is circling us. No way out. Drakain's eyes flicked toward the far ridge, where the horizon blurred into a roiling sea of enemy movement. Every tactical option felt like a death sentence. His throat tightened as realization hit. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was an execution. Back in the bar, Drakain paused, his organic hand clenched around his drink, knuckles whitening. I watched my squad die one by one. They were the best soldiers I'd ever served with. Gone, just like that. He snapped his fingers, the sharp sound making more than a few patrons flinch. I ran out of ammunition first, then places to run. Captain Solane's voice was softer now. So what happened next? I was pinned down in the south tunnel, Hive drones closing in. I could hear their claws scraping on the walls. Every step closer, slower, like they knew I had nowhere left to go. The private swallowed hard. What did you do? I prepared to die, Drakain said. That's when he showed up. The human appears. It started with a deafening explosion, the walls shaking with the force of it. Dust rained from the ceiling as the tunnel filled with smoke and fragmented light. Drakain blinked against the haze, his enhanced vision struggling to recalibrate. Then he saw him. A human. Corporal Zaid Morran, standing in the center of the chaos, holding what could only be described as a plasma spear. A crude but effective weapon made from what looked like scavenged enemy parts. His armor was scarred, patched together with bits of hive plating, and his face was something else. Shaved head, wild eyes, grinning like a lunatic. "Need a hand?" Morran's voice echoed down the tunnel, light and casual, as though they weren't both seconds from death. Drakain stared, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing. "Who the hell are you?" "Your new best friend," Zaid replied, hefting his makeshift spear. "Now move your ass if you want to live." The human surged forward, cutting through the first wave of drones with brutal efficiency. His movements were unrefined, more street brawler than soldier, but they worked. Drakain followed, too stunned to argue. The tunnel became a gauntlet of death. Zaid hurled homemade explosives, their shockwaves throwing enemy drones into twisted heaps. When they reached a split in the tunnel, Zaid stopped just long enough to plant a charge on the support beam. "What are you doing?" Drakain barked. "Buying us time," Zaid said, slapping the detonator. The beam collapsed behind them with a satisfying crunch, sealing the drones on the other side. Drakain couldn't help but glance at his new companion. "You're insane." "Yeah, well," Zaid shrugged. "It's been a long day." Back at the bar, Drakain's voice dropped to a near whisper. "That was how it started. He saved my life, then dragged me deeper into the hive. Said he had a plan so reckless I should have shot him on the spot." He raised his glass, the liquid swirling darkly inside. "But instead, I followed him." The room remained silent, every eye fixed on Drakain. Even Selene said nothing, waiting for what came next. Drakain's gaze darkened. That human didn't just want to survive, he wanted to burn the hive to the ground. Burn it to the ground? Drakain leaned against the tunnel wall, his breathing sharp and shallow, every muscle in his body tensed as the words echoed in his mind. Sweat mingled with the grime on his face, dripping down his neck and soaking into the edges of his battle-worn suit. His HUD flickered with warnings, energy reserves were dwindling, neural link stability wavering, but it was nothing compared to the madness unfolding in front of him. Zaid Morran stood a few paces ahead, casually adjusting the bindings on his makeshift plasma spear, the weapon glowing faintly in the dim tunnel. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous glint, like a man who thrived on chaos and had long since made peace with it. "Yeah," Zaid said, rolling his shoulders as if preparing for a casual stroll instead of a death march. "Burn it to the ground. You don't think small if you want to survive a place like this. You think big, wild. Otherwise, you're just another piece of meat." Drakain glanced down the corridor ahead. The tunnel walls pulsed faintly with bioluminescent streaks, their organic patterns shifting like veins beneath the skin of some colossal creature. The air was thick and suffocating, carrying a bitter tang that coated his tongue and clung to the back of his throat. "And you have a plan for this big idea of yours?" Drakain's voice carried a bite of skepticism, his eyes narrowing at the human's casual confidence. "Of course I do," Zaid replied, turning back with a grin that bordered on reckless. "But plans are flexible. Think of them like suggestions, guidelines for how things might go if the stars align and the hive doesn't try to eat us in the next 5 minutes." "You mean we're making this up as we go?" "Exactly." Zaid winked. "But trust me, Sergeant, you're going to love the ending." The walls around them shifted again, the rhythmic pulse growing faster, almost like a heartbeat rising in panic. Drakain's instinct screamed a warning. He tightened his grip on his weapon, scanning the shadows ahead. His vision picked up subtle movements in the periphery, a flicker here, a ripple there. They were never alone in the hive. The enemy was always watching, waiting. "We need to move," Drakain muttered, his voice low but commanding. "This place adapts faster than any battlefield we've known, Every second we stay in one spot, it's learning how to trap us. Don't worry, Zaid said, already striding forward, his boots crunching against the organic floor. I've got a map of sorts. He tapped the side of his head. All up here. Drakain followed, the faint hum of his suit's servos the only sound accompanying their footsteps. The tunnel twisted and narrowed, forcing them to duck beneath hanging tendrils that twitched at their presence. The air grew warmer, thick with moisture, the kind that pressed against the lungs like a lead weight. You still haven't told me how you got here, Drakain said, his voice cutting through the silence. You weren't part of the Venar 7 garrison. No human was. Zaid chuckled, the sound rough and unrefined, like gravel being ground beneath a boot. Let's just say I was in the neighborhood. One bad jump through a wormhole later and, well, here I am. Lucky you, right? Lucky, Drakain muttered under his breath, his eyes darting to the shifting walls again. That's one word for it. They continued deeper, the tunnel opening into a larger chamber. Laser plasma displays flickered on ruined consoles embedded into the walls, their readouts displaying hive activity in erratic pulses of alien text. A low, thrumming vibration filled the air, resonating through their bones. This is it, Zaid said, gesturing to the room with a theatrical flourish. The heart of the local control node. If we take this out, it'll throw the entire sector into chaos for, I don't know, long enough for us to make a dramatic escape. Drakain's eyes narrowed. What's the catch? No catch. Zaid's grin grew wider. Except that the node is alive. It won't like what we're about to do. Drakain approached the nearest console, his synthetic eye scanning the readout. The biological entity at the core of the node pulsed beneath the floor, its life force radiating through the chamber like a malevolent beacon. Tendrils snaked from the central mass, connecting to every wall and ceiling, feeding data back to the greater hive. You want to kill this thing? Drakain asked, his voice barely masking his incredulity. Not just kill it, Zaid corrected, kneeling beside a bundle of wires and alien bioconduits. We're going to erase it, wipe its neural patterns clean, and scramble the data streams. The hive won't know what hit it. How long will that take? Long enough for things to get messy, Zaid replied, pulling a small device from his belt. A pulsing sphere that looked like a cross between a grenade and a portable computer. But if you've got a better idea, Drakain sighed, shaking his head. Do it. The air grew even heavier as Zaid planted the device at the node's core. The floor trembled beneath their feet, and the pulsing light grew erratic, shifting from its steady rhythm to a chaotic strobe. Drakain felt it before he heard it. A surge in the air, a ripple through the fabric of the hive's consciousness. Something vast and ancient had noticed them. The walls seemed to inhale, the tendrils twitching violently. They know we're here, Drakain said, his voice tight. Good, Zaid replied, his eyes gleaming. Let's make sure they remember us. The first wave hit before Drakain could respond. Drones burst from the walls, their multi-limbed forms moving with terrifying speed. Their screeches reverberated through the chamber, a cacophony of rage and hunger. Cover me! Zaid shouted, working frantically on the device. Drakain raised his rifle, firing in controlled bursts. Blue plasma arcs lit up the chamber, each shot burning through the chitinous armor of the advancing drones. He moved with brutal efficiency, stepping into the rhythm of battle like a dancer returning to a familiar stage. A drone lunged at him, its mandibles snapping. Drakain pivoted, slamming his cybernetic arm into its torso with enough force to crack its exoskeleton. The creature writhed on the floor, its limbs twitching spasmodically. Almost. Got it. Zaid's voice was strained, sweat streaming down his face. The device beeped rapidly, the light on its surface shifting from red to green. Done! Then run! Drakain barked, grabbing Zaid by the collar and pulling him toward the exit. The chamber exploded behind them, tendrils flailing wildly as the node collapsed in on itself. The air filled with an otherworldly scream, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They sprinted down the corridor, the walls collapsing behind them, the hive's fury hot on their heels. Drakain's lungs burned, every step an act of defiance against the gravity of inevitability. Did I mention this part of the plan is my favorite? Zaid shouted, his voice breathless but exhilarated. You're insane, Drakain growled, but his lips twisted into something that might have been a grin, and for the first time in days, he felt alive. Drakain's footsteps echoed harshly in the narrow corridor as the hive seemed to close in on them, alive with rage. Behind him, tendrils of bioluminescent light flickered in frantic, pulsing patterns, reflecting the system's panic. The air was suffused with a suffocating heat that pressed against his skin like a second layer, clinging and relentless. Every breath tasted metallic, sharp, and heavy, laced with the bitter tang of the hive's decaying infrastructure. You call this part of the plan your favorite? Drakain shouted over his shoulder, not breaking stride. His voice came out raw, strained, each syllable punched through clenched teeth. You didn't mention the collapsing tunnel and the homicidal swarm. Details! Zaid yelled back, barely keeping pace. His eyes were wild, sweat streaking his face, though the ever-present grin hadn't faded. Plans get boring without a little chaos. Chaos was the perfect word for it. The hive wasn't just collapsing, it was convulsing. The biological pathways shifted like something alive, reshaping themselves to trap intruders. Veins of alien matter twisted across the walls, snapping like whipcords. Behind them, the drones regrouped, their multi-jointed limbs tearing through debris, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Drakain glanced at his weapon's energy meter. Critical levels. His rifle hummed weakly, the plasma feed flickering in and out of sync. One more shot, maybe two, before it became nothing more than an overpriced club. He slowed his pace just long enough to pivot, leveling the rifle at the nearest drone. The recoil jarred through his shoulder, and a searing arc of blue light carved the creature in half, its upper body hitting the ground with a wet crunch. Keep running! Zaid waved him on, pulling a small device from his belt and tossing it down the tunnel behind them. The explosive blinked once before detonating in a blinding flash. The walls shook violently, a rain of organic debris cutting off the approaching swarm, at least temporarily. They rounded a corner, bursting into a larger chamber bathed in flickering green light. Heads-up displays embedded into the walls sputtered, scrolling alien script that updated in real time. The hive was adapting, trying to compensate for the neural disruption caused by their sabotage. But it wasn't fast enough, yet. Drakain paused, his pulse thudding in his ears. His hands tightened around his rifle as his eyes swept the room for threats. How far to the exit? His words came clipped, his breath catching between sentences. Zaid crouched beside one of the consoles, his fingers skimming across its surface. Close, he said, his tone serious for the first time. But the hive won't let us walk out without a fight. The main access tunnels are probably crawling with drones by now. No, probably about it, Drakain muttered, stepping closer to the display. His synthetic eyes zoomed in on a cluster of red markers, moving rapidly toward their position. He tapped the side of his helmet, recalibrating the tactical feed. They're converging from 3 directions. If we don't move now, we'll be cut off. Zaid leaned back, stretching his arms like he had all the time in the world. So, we improvise. His eyes glinted in the dim light. We take an alternate route. And where exactly does this alternate route lead? Drakain asked, his tone dry. Zaid stood, brushing dust from his patched armor. Into the lower hive structure. The drones won't expect us to go deeper. That's because it's suicide, Drakain shot back. The lower levels are crawling with... but that's where the fun begins. Zaid interrupted, spinning his spear lazily in one hand. Lower levels mean fewer coordinated attacks. The neural disruption will mess with their ability to mount a proper defense. It's a risk, sure, but staying here isn't exactly a retirement plan. Drakain stared at him, weighing the odds. Logic screamed against the idea. Every tactical protocol drilled into his head told him that retreating deeper into enemy territory was madness. And yet, I'll regret this, Drakain said finally, turning toward the darkened corridor at the far end of the chamber. Lead the way. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the hive's spongy floor. The temperature dropped as they descended, the walls tightening around them like a throat closing in slow motion. Thin strands of bioluminescent material traced the passageway, glowing faintly in soft greens and purples, casting eerie shadows that danced with every step. The air smelled of something old and rotten, a mix of decaying organic matter and chemical rot that made Drakain's stomach churn. The sounds of distant movement echoed from somewhere far below, scrapes, clicks, and the occasional guttural growl. It was enough to make the skin on his back prickle. Zaid's voice broke the silence. You know, for all their fancy biology and hive mind coordination, these bugs aren't half as scary as people think. Drakain gave him a sidelong glance. You've seen them rip men limb from limb, right? Sure, Zaid said with a casual shrug. But they're predictable. Humans, though, we're something else. Give us a bad day and a sharp object, and we'll make history. You're definitely proof of that, Drakain muttered, keeping his weapon raised. They passed through another chamber, this one lined with pods hanging from the ceiling, translucent sacs filled with pale shapes. Drakain averted his gaze, refusing to look too closely at what might be inside. He focused on the path ahead, every sense tuned to the slightest shift in the air. I think we're clear, Zaid said, pausing at the edge of a narrow crevasse that cut across the tunnel. We cross here, and we should come out near an old ventilation shaft. That'll take us back to the upper levels. Drakain stepped to the edge, peering down into the darkness. This plan better work. Relax, Zaid grinned, extending a hand toward Drakain. What's the worst that could happen? Before Drakain could respond, the ground beneath them trembled, a low rumble building from somewhere deep below. The air grew heavy, charged with a strange static-like pressure. The bioluminescent strands flickered erratically, their soft glow turning a harsh, angry red. That's not a good sign, Drakain said, stepping back instinctively. Zaid's grin faded. No, it's not. A deafening screech tore through the tunnel, shaking the walls and sending a cascade of dust and debris raining down on them. The sound was raw and primal, filled with fury and hunger. Run, Zaid said, his voice flat and serious now. Don't stop. Don't look back. Drakain didn't need to be told twice. His muscles coiled as he bolted forward, every step reverberating through the narrow corridor. Behind him, the screeching grew louder, the sound of countless claws skittering over stone and organic matter, closing the distance with terrifying speed. The hunt had begun. The screech tore through the tunnel like a jagged blade, resonating off the walls and rattling through Drakain's bones. His pulse surged, muscles locking for a split second as instinct screamed for him to stop, to brace, to fight. But he knew better. Keep moving. Don't look back. Because it was, Zaid said, his voice unusually serious. The Hive's not done with us yet. A flicker of movement caught Drakain's attention, a shadow shifting at the edge of his vision. He stopped, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. What is it? Zaid asked, following his gaze. Something's watching us, Drakain whispered. The shadows deepened, and a low, rumbling sound filled the air, almost like a growl, but far too resonant for any ordinary creature. Zaid's grip tightened on his spear. Guess we're not alone after all. The tunnel ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, its darkness growing thicker with each step. Whatever waited for them, it was close. Too close. Stay sharp, Drakain said, his voice barely audible. We're walking into something bigger than a simple escape. Zaid chuckled softly, the sound laced with tension. Good. I was starting to get bored. They pressed forward, the weight of the hive closing in around them like a living trap. Ahead, the darkness pulsed with hidden danger, and the faintest whisper of movement hinted at what lay in wait. The tunnel narrowed, closing around them like a ribcage of fused bone and stone. Every step carried a weight, each breath dragging thicker in Drakain's chest. The air was warm, charged with the hive's restless energy, whispering something ancient and primal through the walls. He felt it in his spine, that creeping sensation that they were being watched, hunted by something that knew the tunnels far better than they ever could. Zaid kept his pace steady, but his eyes were sharp, scanning every flicker of movement in the distance. His knuckles whitened around his plasma spear, the easy confidence he'd worn like armor replaced with a focused tension. He didn't speak, and that made Drakain more uneasy than any sound ever could. Zaid always had something to say. Silence from him wasn't just strange. It was dangerous. A faint tremor passed through the floor beneath their feet, subtle at first, then growing stronger. A rhythmic vibration that seemed to grow closer with each pulse. "Do you feel that?" Drakain whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Zaid gave a small nod, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Yeah," he muttered. "It's not just footsteps. It's too deliberate." The tunnel walls seemed to tighten around them again, the bioluminescent patterns shifting into jagged, erratic shapes. The red glow pulsed faster, synchronized with the tremor beneath their feet, like a heartbeat rising toward a crescendo. Drakain's HUD flickered, registering the fluctuations in energy around them. "Something's drawing power from the Hive's central core," he said. "A lot of power, more than anything we've seen so far." "Central core?" Zaid glanced at him, one brow raised. "You mean like a nervous system?" "More like a control node," Drakain corrected. "If we're near the core, it's not just guiding drones. It's watching every step we take, adjusting the Hive's structure to keep us boxed in." A flicker of realization crossed Zaid's face, followed quickly by a mischievous grin. "Perfect. That means we're close to the good part." "The good part?" Drakain echoed, incredulous. "This isn't a story, Zaid. The Hive's reacting faster than we can move. If it traps us here, there's no way out." "Which is exactly why we push forward," Zaid said, tapping the wall beside him. "Control nodes don't just adapt, they coordinate everything. We take it down, and we don't just escape, we blind the Hive. Every drone for miles will be lost in the dark." "And you think that's a good plan?" "It's not just good," Zaid said, with a wolfish grin. "It's the only plan we've got." A deep growl echoed from somewhere ahead, rolling down the tunnel like distant thunder. Both men froze, eyes locking in silent agreement. "Move," Drakain said, his voice barely a whisper. They slipped into a faster pace, every muscle coiled, ready to spring at the first sign of danger. The tunnel sloped downward into a larger chamber, its walls pulsing with dull red light. Organic tendrils snaked across the floor, weaving into thick knots that pulsed in time with the tremors beneath them. Heads-up displays flickered on ruined consoles scattered throughout the chamber, displaying alien script that updated in stuttering bursts. Drakain scanned the room, his synthetic eye sweeping for signs of movement. "We're not alone," he said, his voice low. "No," Zaid agreed, his gaze fixed on the far end of the chamber. "We're definitely not." From the shadows, a hulking figure emerged, another Karnox warrior, its chitinous body reflecting the red light in fractured patterns. But this one was different. Its armor gleamed with a metallic sheen, reinforced with layers of bioalloy that pulsed with energy. "Reinforced," Drakain muttered, his grip tightening on his rifle. "It's connected to the core. This isn't just a warrior, it's a guardian." "Guardian or not," Zaid said, raising his spear, "it's blocking our way, and we're not here to negotiate." The Karnox's eyes locked onto them, its mandibles clicking in a deliberate rhythm. It charged, its footsteps shaking the ground with every step. Drakain moved first, sidestepping its initial lunge and firing a volley of plasma rounds at its exposed flank. The shots glanced off its armor, barely leaving a mark. Zaid closed the distance in a heartbeat, driving his spear into the creature's side. Sparks flew as the weapon bit into its armor, but the Karnox twisted with unnatural speed, swiping at him with a scythe-like limb. Drakain rushed to Zaid's side, using his cybernetic arm to block the next strike. The impact sent a jolt through his entire body, but he held his ground, shoving the creature back. "We can't win this head-on," he growled. "We need to take out its connection to the core." Zaid nodded, already scanning the chamber for weak points. His eyes landed on a cluster of glowing nodes embedded in the wall. "There," he said, pointing. "Those nodes are feeding it power. We knock them out, it's just another oversized bug." "Cover me," Drakain said, sprinting toward the nearest node. Zaid didn't hesitate, throwing himself between the Karnox and Drakain, his spear flashing in rapid arcs as he deflected the creature's strikes. His movements were fast and fluid, each motion blending into the next like a well-rehearsed dance. Drakain reached the node, slamming the butt of his rifle into its surface. The casing cracked, spilling glowing liquid that hissed and steamed as it hit the floor. The Karnox let out a guttural roar, its body convulsing as the energy feeding it began to wane. "One down," Drakain called, moving to the next node. "Hurry up," Zaid shouted, his voice strained. "This thing's getting desperate." Drakain smashed the second node, then the third, each one weakening the Karnox further. Its movements grew sluggish, its strikes losing their force. Finally, with a final swing of his rifle, Drakain shattered the last node. The Karnox stumbled, its body collapsing in on itself as the energy drained from its core. The chamber fell silent, save for the crackle of dying circuits and the labored breathing of the two men. "That," Zaid said, leaning on his spear, "was a solid 9. Maybe 9.5. Drakain gave him a tired smile. "Still no fireworks, though." "Next time," Zaid promised, his eyes gleaming. Drakain turned toward the far end of the chamber, where a narrow corridor led deeper into the hive. "If there's a next time," he said, stepping forward, "let's finish this." Zaid followed, his footsteps echoing softly in the darkness. Behind them, the chamber pulsed one final time before falling dark. Ahead, the core awaited, along with whatever secrets it still had to reveal. The narrow corridor seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, its walls breathing with a slow, unsettling rhythm. Each step carried Drakain deeper into the heart of the hive, where the air was thick with warmth, almost humid, clinging to his skin like a living thing. His enhanced vision flickered between layers of darkness, picking up faint traces of movement at the edges. The ground beneath their feet pulsed faintly, like the artery of some colossal beast. "This place feels alive," Zaid muttered, his voice barely breaking the heavy silence. He wiped sweat from his forehead, his eyes scanning the writhing tendrils along the ceiling. "More than just architecture, it's reacting to us." "It is alive," Drakain said, his voice calm but tense. "The hive doesn't just adapt, it evolves. Every inch of this structure is connected to the core like a central brain. We're walking on nerves." He tapped his rifle lightly. "It knows we're here. Every step brings us closer to whatever it's protecting." Zaid's grin returned, faint but unshaken. "Good. I'm tired of knocking on doors. Time to kick one in." The corridor widened abruptly into a cavernous chamber, its walls lined with clusters of glowing organic nodes. Heads-up displays flickered erratically across strange consoles embedded into the walls, spitting alien script in bursts that almost seemed frantic. Tendrils snaked across the floor in chaotic patterns, each pulse a ripple of energy radiating from the massive structure at the center of the room. The core. It was a living monolith, its surface shifting like liquid metal. It pulsed with waves of light, cycling through colors that seemed just wrong enough to make Drakain's head ache. This wasn't just a machine. It was something far more alien, something alive in ways that defied logic and instinct. "Beautiful, in a horrifying way," Zaid said, stepping closer, his footsteps light and deliberate. He tilted his head as if listening for something only he could hear. "I bet it sings when no one's around." Drakain raised his rifle, the targeting reticle locking onto the core's surface. "If it does, we're about to end its greatest performance." His finger hovered over the trigger, but before he could fire, the entire chamber shifted. The floor rippled beneath their feet, throwing them off balance as tendrils lashed out from the core's base, slamming into the walls with bone-rattling force. The lights flickered violently, the alien script on the displays shifting into chaotic symbols. Drakain steadied himself, his rifle snapping back up. "It's not going down without a fight." "Good," Zaid growled, spinning his plasma spear in one fluid motion. "Neither are we." The tendrils lashed again, faster this time. One whipped toward Drakain with a crack like a lightning strike. He dodged to the side, firing as he moved. Blue plasma bolts streaked through the air, burning deep into the core's surface, but the damage healed almost instantly, the liquid metal skin knitting itself back together. It's regenerating too fast, Drakain shouted. We need to overload it. On it! Zaid sprinted toward one of the consoles, his fingers flying across the alien controls. I can reroute its internal power network. If we overload the central nodes, it'll tear itself apart from the inside. Another tendril smashed into the ground where Zaid had stood moments before, cracking the floor open in a spray of glowing debris. Drakain covered him, his shots keeping the core's defenses occupied. Hurry! Drakain barked, firing a sustained burst into a cluster of nodes on the wall. Sparks flew as the nodes flickered and dimmed, their connection to the core weakening. The tendrils grew more erratic, their strikes less coordinated. Almost. There. Zaid muttered, sweat pouring down his face. His eyes flickered between the alien symbols and the heads-up display's chaotic readouts. He tapped one last sequence, and the chamber trembled violently beneath them. The core let out a sound, deep, guttural, and filled with rage. It wasn't a machine scream, nor was it entirely organic. It was something in between, a sound that dug into the marrow of their bones. That's our cue, Zaid said, backing away from the console. We've got maybe 90 seconds before it goes critical. Enough time for a dramatic exit, don't you think? Drakain didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted for the far side of the chamber, the floor crumbling beneath their feet as the core began to implode. Each step sent shock waves rippling outward, collapsing parts of the chamber in a cascade of debris. The tunnel ahead flickered with bursts of light as energy from the core surged through the surrounding structures. The walls twisted and buckled, and the organic pathways writhed like a creature in its death throes. This way! Zaid shouted, veering left into a narrow passage. Drakain followed, his legs burning with every stride. His HUD flashed more warnings, heat levels spiking, power reserves dwindling, but he pushed it all aside. Survival was the only objective now. The passage opened into a jagged vertical shaft. A faint breeze, real air, not the thick, suffocating heat of the hive, whispered from above. Ventilation shaft, Zaid called, pointing upward. That's our way out. Drakain glanced up, his synthetic eye scanning the distance. It wasn't far, but the walls were slick with bioluminescent residue, and there were no obvious handholds. We'll have to climb, he said grimly. Zaid grinned, slapping him on the shoulder. Good thing I've got strong legs. The core let out another roar, the chamber behind them collapsing in on itself. The heat rose in an instant, scorching the air and filling the passage with blinding light. Drakain grabbed the nearest ledge and hauled himself upward, his muscles screaming in protest. Zaid followed close behind, his movements quick and efficient despite the chaos below. They climbed in silence, the only sounds the scrape of their boots against the walls and the distant wail of the dying core. The shaft grew brighter with each meter, the taste of fresh air tantalizingly close. With one final push, Drakain reached the top, collapsing onto the ground with a gasp. The air was cool, clean, and for the first time in hours it didn't feel like the hive was breathing down his neck. Zaid pulled himself up beside him, rolling onto his back and laughing breathlessly. Remind me to add escape collapsing alien hive to my resume. Drakain sat up, his eyes scanning the horizon. The hive's outer walls shimmered in the distance, the cores collapsed, sending shock waves through the surrounding structures. The battle wasn't over, but they had survived the worst of it, for now. We're not done yet, Drakain said, his voice steady despite the weight of exhaustion. Zaid's grin widened. No, we're not, but we just made one hell of an entrance. The ground beneath them shook again, but this time it felt different, a warning of something far worse brewing beneath the surface. Let's keep moving, Drakain said, rising to his feet. The hive isn't going down without taking the rest of us with it. The ground trembled beneath their feet, sending ripples through the cracked stone and exposed organic tendrils. Drakain steadied himself against a nearby wall, his synthetic eye flickering through layers of readouts as he surveyed the landscape ahead. The outer walls of the hive shimmered in the distance, fractured and bleeding light from the core's collapse. Each pulse of energy sent a visible shockwave through the surrounding terrain, reshaping it into something twisted and unrecognizable. We have maybe 10 minutes before this place implodes, Drakain said. his voice sharp with urgency. He traced a rough path on his heads-up display, mapping a route to the extraction point. If we're lucky, that tunnel system to the east might still be intact. It'll take us directly to the old landing zone. Zaid adjusted his grip on the plasma spear, wiping sweat from his brow. Lucky? I thought you didn't believe in luck. I don't, Drakain replied without missing a beat. I believe in planning, execution, and adaptability. Luck is just a word people use when they survive their own mistakes. Zaid smirked. Then it's a good thing we've been making the right kind of mistakes so far. They moved quickly, keeping low as they weaved through the ruins of the outer hive. The terrain was a chaotic blend of crumbling stone and collapsed bioarchitecture, with alien structures jutting out at odd angles. Each step felt like a gamble. One wrong move, and the unstable ground beneath them could give way entirely. The heads-up display blinked again, highlighting a series of narrow passageways leading toward the tunnel system. Drakain paused, scanning the area with his enhanced vision. The entrance is just ahead. We'll need to move fast. If the Hive sends another wave of Karnoks, we won't have the firepower to hold them off. Zaid nodded, his expression uncharacteristically serious. Agreed. But let's assume they're already waiting for us. If I were them, I'd cut off every possible exit and force us into a kill zone. Drakain glanced at him, impressed despite the situation. Good assessment. What's your counter-strategy? Zaid knelt, tracing a rough outline of the terrain in the dust. We split the route into 3 phases. Phase 1, distraction. I'll rig one of these tendrils to overload and trigger a localized detonation. That should draw whatever's guarding the entrance toward the blast. Phase 2, infiltration. While they're distracted, we move in under cover and secure the tunnel. Phase 3, control. We barricade the entrance behind us to slow any reinforcements. The longer it takes them to adapt, the better our odds. Drakain studied the plan, nodding slowly. It's risky, but it'll work. Start the setup. I'll cover you. Zaid pulled a small satchel from his belt, selecting a cluster of explosives. He moved with the confidence of someone who had danced with chaos before and always came out grinning. Drakain kept his rifle raised, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The hive was too quiet. It wasn't the absence of sound that unnerved him. It was the oppressive stillness, the feeling that every shadow held eyes and teeth. His synthetic eye picked up faint heat signatures just beyond the collapsed ridge, too faint for drones, too deliberate to be anything else. They're watching, Drakain muttered, his finger resting on the trigger, waiting for us to commit. Good, Zaid said without looking up. Let them watch. They'll have front-row seats for the fireworks. The charges blinked to life with a soft click, their light pulsing in steady intervals. Zaid dusted off his hands and stood. Ready? Drakain gave a curt nod. Do it. Zaid hit the detonator. The explosion was instantaneous, ripping through the tendrils and sending a plume of alien matter into the air. The ground shuddered violently, chunks of bioarchitecture collapsing into the crater. A high-pitched wail echoed from the distance, a collective scream from whatever was connected to the hive's network. Phase 2, Zaid said, already moving toward the tunnel entrance. Time to disappear. They sprinted toward the opening, the ground still shaking beneath them. The tunnel was dark and narrow, its walls slick with bioluminescent residue that clung to their boots and gloves. Drakain's HUD flickered as it adjusted to the low light, mapping their path through the labyrinthine structure. I'll seal the entrance, Drakain said, stopping near the mouth of the tunnel. He tapped into the wall's organic framework, overriding its neural pathways. The tendrils recoiled and twisted, closing the entrance behind them with a sickening snap. Zaid leaned against the wall, catching his breath. That should slow them down, for a few minutes at least. Drakain nodded, his eyes scanning the tunnel ahead. It'll have to be enough. We're on borrowed time now. They moved deeper into the tunnel, the air growing colder with each step. The walls seemed less organic here, more like ancient stone fused with alien growth. It reminded Drakain of the ruins on Kalor Prime, a place where time and biology had intertwined in ways no one could fully explain. Zaid broke the silence. You ever think about what it'll be like when all of this is over? Drakain glanced at him, surprised by the question. Not really. War's always been the constant. Everything else is just noise. See, that's where you're wrong, Zaid said with a grin. There's always something after. Maybe it's quieter, maybe it's uglier, but it's there. And it's waiting for us to figure out what to do with it. Drakain didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure if it was exhaustion or something else, but for the first time in a long while he found himself considering the possibility. What would it feel like to live without the constant hum of battle? Before he could answer, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber, the old landing zone. The remnants of ancient ships lay scattered across the floor, their hulls covered in layers of organic growth. Heads-up displays flickered weakly from shattered consoles, their lights casting long shadows across the wreckage. There, Drakain said, pointing to a battered shuttle near the far wall. It looks intact enough to fly. Zaid grinned. Finally, some good news. They approached the shuttle cautiously, their eyes scanning every corner of the chamber. Drakain reached the control panel first, tapping into the ship's system. The display flickered to life, its readout showing minimal power, but enough to get them airborne. It's not pretty, but it'll work, Drakain said, punching in the startup sequence. Zaid climbed into the co-pilot seat, his fingers dancing across the controls. I've flown worse. Let's get the hell out of here. The ship rumbled beneath them, its engines roaring to life. The ground trembled again, the Hive's collapse accelerating as the core's death spiral reached its peak. Drakain tightened his grip on the controls. Hold on, this is going to be rough. Zaid laughed, leaning back in his seat. Rough? Drakain, my friend. I wouldn't want it any other way. The shuttle groaned as its engines surged to life, shaking off years of decay, like a creature waking from a long slumber. Control displays flickered, alien script blending with ancient human flight systems. Drakain tightened his grip on the controls, feeling the low vibrations reverberate through his bones, each pulse matching the tremor of the collapsing hive outside. His synthetic eye flickered with readouts, structural instability at critical levels. Time was a luxury they didn't have. Engines are online, Zaid called out from the co-pilot seat, his fingers dancing over the heads-up display. We've got just enough power to break atmosphere if this bucket holds together. It'll hold, Drakain said, his voice steady, unflinching. He keyed in the launch sequence, the shuttle rattling beneath them. We don't have a choice. The ground outside split apart as the Hive's death throes sent shockwaves across the landscape. Entire sections of the structure collapsed inward, swallowed by the raging chaos of its failing core. Massive tendrils writhed in the distance, desperate and blind, lashing out in futile defiance. Zaid glanced at the sensor feed. We've got movement, fast and angry. They're not letting us leave without a goodbye party. Drakain's eyes narrowed. Then we won't leave quietly. He pushed the throttle forward, and the shuttle lurched into motion, scraping against jagged remnants of the Hive as it lifted off the ground. Sparks rained across the viewport, but the ship held steady, surging upward through the collapsing chamber. A chorus of guttural screeches echoed behind them, the swarm closing in fast. Karnok's warriors emerged from the crumbling walls, their chitinous bodies gleaming in the flickering light. They sprinted with terrifying speed, claws tearing into the shuttle's path, their eyes glowing with feral hunger. "Here they come!" Zaid shouted, locking onto the nearest cluster with the ship's rudimentary weapon system. He fired a volley of plasma bolts, each shot carving bright scars through the advancing horde. "I hope you've got a plan, because I'm fresh out of miracles." "Stay alive long enough to watch me improvise," Drakain said, banking hard to avoid a collapsing support column. The ship groaned under the strain, the artificial gravity flickering as debris hammered against its hull. His focus never wavered, every instinct honed to a single purpose: escape. They shot through the upper layers of the Hive, weaving between collapsing structures and ruptured conduits. The tunnel narrowed, forcing Drakain to rely on his enhanced vision to navigate the maze of twisting passages. Each turn felt impossibly tight, every second bringing them closer to freedom or disaster. A burst of light ahead signaled the tunnel's end, the shattered sky bleeding through the cracks. Drakain pushed the shuttle to its limits, the engines roaring as they climbed toward the opening. Behind them, the swarm grew louder, relentless, and hungry. "Almost there," Zaid said, his voice breathless but unwavering. "Just a little more." The final stretch of tunnel collapsed in on itself as they reached the breach, the force of the implosion propelling them into open air. The shuttle wobbled violently, alarms screaming across the control panels. Drakain fought to stabilize the ship, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. "We're clear," he said, exhaling for the first time in minutes. "Course correction engaged. Stabilizing." Zaid leaned back in his seat, his face flushed with adrenaline. "I'd say that was a solid 10. Full marks for drama and execution." Drakain glanced at him, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Still no fireworks. "Give me a minute," Zaid said, pointing to the viewport. "Look behind us." Drakain turned just in time to see the Hive implode in a cascade of light and fury. The core collapsed inward, dragging the surrounding structures into a swirling vortex of energy. The sky lit up with a blinding flash, waves of molten debris rippling outward in a final act of defiance. The Hive was gone, consumed by its own rage. Zaid watched the destruction in silence for a long moment, then let out a low chuckle. "I told you it would be big." Drakain leaned back in his seat, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in days. He closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the weight of survival settle around him. Big doesn't even begin to cover it. The ship's control system beeped, the heads-up display shifting to show a navigational grid. Drakain keyed in the coordinates for the nearest Alliance outpost, his synthetic eye flickering with updated flight data. The journey home wouldn't be easy, but at least it was possible. Zaid leaned forward, studying the display. "So what's next, Sergeant?" Drakain didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the empty sky ahead, the endless possibilities stretching out before them. He thought about the battles he'd fought, the worlds he'd seen crumble, the comrades he'd lost along the way. Every war had a cost, and yet here he was, still standing, still fighting. "What's next?" Drakain repeated, his voice thoughtful, almost distant. "We keep moving, we rebuild, we make sure the next battle isn't one we just survive, we make sure it's one we win." Zaid nodded, a rare seriousness in his expression. "Winning sounds nice for a change." "It won't be easy," Drakain said. "Nothing worth fighting forever is, but if there's one thing I've learned from all of this—" He paused, his gaze hardening. "It's that the galaxy isn't ready for what humans can do when we're pushed to the edge." Zaid grinned, leaning back in his seat. "Yeah, they'll figure it out soon enough." The shuttle soared into the darkness, its course steady and unrelenting. Behind them, the ruins of the Hive smoldered in the fading light, a testament to what they had endured, and a warning to whatever lay ahead. Drakain watched the stars blur into streaks as they entered the jump path, his mind already calculating the next move. There would be more battles, more enemies, and more impossible odds. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something dangerously close to hope. "Let them come," Drakain said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that felt like a promise. "We'll be ready." And in that moment, as the stars folded around them, the future no longer seemed like a shadow hanging over them. It felt like a challenge they would meet head-on no matter what waited on the other side. Because humanity wasn't just a survivor. It was a force to be reckoned with, and the galaxy was about to learn that the hard way.